Comment down below where you're watching from and don't forget to like and subscribe if you hate Karen. In the opening of this narrative, Reggie Dubosi introduces himself as the protagonist, providing a glimpse into his life. He is a successful software developer who has struck it rich with an AI algorithm. Reggie describes his home, a modern, expensive property in Willow Creek Estates, and introduces the primary antagonist of the story, Dolores Crabtree, the president of the HOA. Reggie's house, standing out in an area filled with beige conformity, symbolizes his individuality and success, especially through his eye-catching bright yellow Lamborghini Urus, affectionately nicknamed Sunshine. The tone in this section reflects Reggie's laid-back yet confident personality. He is a man who enjoys his life, especially his flashy car, and doesn't fit into the mold that Willow Creek Estates residents uphold. The HOA's tight control over trivial matters like lawn care and aesthetics serves as a backdrop to the rising tension. The introduction of Dolores Crabtree further sets up her as a caricature of the Karen figure, a person so invested in conformity and rule enforcement that she becomes an antagonist to Reggie's carefree approach to life. We also see a humorous note when Reggie refers to his Lamborghini as loud, obnoxious, and an attention grabber for Dolores, signaling the impending conflict between them. It sets the stage for the war between Reggie and HOA led by Karen. This part effectively sets up the stage for the conflict and provides insight into Reggie's character, establishing the tone and tension for the rest of the narrative. After settling into the routine of his quiet, if occasionally uncomfortable, life in Willow Creek Estates, Reggie Dubosi is confronted with the first signs of tension when Dolores Crabtree, the overbearing president of the HOA, begins to escalate her efforts against him. At first, it starts with trivial issues, complaints about his bright yellow Lamborghini Urus, which she views as too loud and attention-grabbing for the otherwise beige and uniform neighborhood. However, as the HOA president, Dolores has the power to enforce various rules about aesthetics, noise levels, and conformity, which she takes very seriously. Her micromanaging extends to the most minor details, such as Reggie's car attracting unwanted wildlife, a charge so absurd that Reggie can barely keep his composure when he hears it. Reggie, however, isn't the typical homeowner that would simply roll over under such pressure. He's a successful software developer, confident in his achievements and his property rights, and he's not afraid to push back. He reads the HOA bylaws, thoroughly understanding the legal framework surrounding his home and car, and he politely but firmly rejects each and every accusation that Dolores throws at him. He maintains his stance on the law, demonstrating that his car is legally parked and there's no justification for the HOA's intrusion. The tension builds, however, as Dolores' tactics become more personal, and she begins to take her vendetta further. What starts as a simple matter of HOA rules quickly escalates into something more malicious, with Dolores becoming increasingly fixated on Reggie and his bright yellow Lamborghini. At this point, the real problem isn't his car. It's Dolores' unwillingness to accept any deviation from her vision of the perfect neighborhood, a vision that doesn't include the vibrancy that Reggie's life and car represent. Eventually, Dolores becomes more persistent and aggressive in her complaints, and the situation evolves from a simple HOA violation notice to a targeted campaign of harassment. Reggie, whose only crime is owning a car that attracts attention and doesn't conform to the neighborhood's strict aesthetic standards, feels the growing weight of Dolores' actions. It becomes clear that this is no longer just about the car, it's about her rigid and narrow view of what is acceptable in her world, and Reggie, with his unyielding individuality, is exactly the kind of person Dolores feels compelled to control. In the next stages of this saga, Reggie's sense of personal rights and fairness will be tested. The HOA's ongoing attempts to pigeonhole him will only fuel his determination to stand up for what is right, not just for himself, but for anyone else in the neighborhood who might be subjected to Dolores' overreach. At this point, Reggie knows that he can't let this go. Something needs to change. One fateful morning, Reggie Dubosi is faced with an extraordinary and outrageous situation. Having just returned to Willow Creek Estates after a brief business trip, Reggie parks his Lamborghini Urus, affectionately nicknamed Sunshine, in his garage, expecting nothing more than a quiet day ahead. He plans to unwind, but instead, the day takes a sharp turn when he notices something unusual outside. While heading to the kitchen for a glass of water, Reggie catches sight of Dolores Crabtree in front of his garage. His first instinct is to brush it off, but the more he watches, the more he realizes that Dolores is not just standing there, she is actively engaging in something far more troubling. As Reggie steps closer, he is stunned to see Dolores holding a pair of bolt cutters, clearly attempting to cut the lock on his garage door. The sheer audacity of the act shocks Reggie. Dolores, who has already shown a history of overreach in her role as HOA president, now seems to have crossed the line into blatant illegal behavior. Reggie, still trying to process what's happening, approaches her with disbelief in his voice and asks, "What in the name of Martha Stewart are you doing?" Dolores, startled, stammers a response, trying to justify her actions by claiming she thought Reggie was involved in something illegal. She even goes so far as to suggest that Reggie was a drug dealer, despite the complete lack of any evidence to support such a claim. The situation is absurd. Dolores, a self-appointed enforcer of neighborhood rules, has now taken matters into her own hands in the worst way possible. She is trying to break into Reggie's garage based on her unfounded assumptions, driven by nothing more than racial bias and an exaggerated sense of power. Reggie, remaining calm despite the situation, realizes that this is no longer just a case of HOA bureaucracy gone wrong. It has escalated to something much more serious. Dolores is violating his property rights and acting on an unfounded, prejudiced suspicion. The act of breaking into his garage, especially with the bolt cutters, could have serious legal consequences. Reggie tells Dolores that he's calling the police, and she makes a weak attempt to defend herself by claiming she had merely wanted to check for illegal activities. Reggie, however, is well beyond patience now. As Reggie reaches for his phone to call the authorities, he's interrupted by the sound of a black SUV screeching to a halt in front of his driveway. At this point, Reggie has no idea what's about to unfold, but things are about to take a ridiculous turn. One that will make this entire HOA debacle something much bigger than just a parking dispute. The scene shifts dramatically when a black SUV suddenly screeches to a halt in front of Reggie Dubosie's house. Three men in plain clothes, all wearing tactical vests, swiftly jump out, shouting, "Police, freeze!" The confusion and chaos of the moment are palpable. Reggie, standing in front of his garage with Dolores Crabtree still holding the bolt cutters, is immediately swept up into a situation he couldn't have possibly imagined. At first, Reggie is stunned and raises his hands, trying to explain that he's the homeowner. He's confused, but it's clear that the police task force doesn't care about the trivial neighborhood squabble involving Dolores and her vendetta against his Lamborghini. Reggie tries to clarify that it's his house and his car, but his words are barely heard above the officer's commands as the situation turns into something far more serious. In this moment, it becomes clear that Dolores' actions, her decision to break into Reggie's garage, are interfering with an ongoing police operation. The officers, now assessing the situation, quickly realize that Dolores has made a critical mistake. They inform Reggie that they've been conducting surveillance in the area for several days as part of a sting operation targeting local drug dealers. Reggie is taken aback. Dolores' knee-jerk assumption about him being involved in criminal activity, based solely on his car and his race, has somehow placed her directly in the path of a major police operation. The officers explain that they've been monitoring several garages in the area, including the one where Reggie parks his car, because the actual suspects had been using the garages as fronts for drug trafficking. They acknowledge that Dolores, in her rush to judge him, has disrupted the operation and unwittingly walked right into a police sting. It's a perfect storm of incompetence and prejudice. As the officers secure Reggie's garage, ensuring that nothing illegal is inside, they begin to apprehend the actual drug dealers, who have been using the vacant garages in the neighborhood to stash their goods. Meanwhile, Dolores, still reeling from the realization that her actions have just brought down the wrath of the police, is standing nearby, completely flustered. She's surrounded by officers, none of whom are impressed by her earlier attempt to justify her actions as neighborhood safety measures. By the time Dolores regains her senses, she's surrounded by police officers who are now questioning her. Reggie can't help but feel a sense of satisfaction as the irony of the situation unfolds. The very woman who had been harassing him for weeks, convinced that his car was a sign of criminal activity, has now found herself at the center of a much larger, much more serious operation. When Dolores finally comes to her senses, the task force has already secured the neighborhood and arrested the drug traffickers. As for Dolores, she's taken into custody for questioning. It's clear that her overzealous, racially motivated assumptions have now led her to a place she never anticipated. Being arrested for trespassing, property damage, and obstruction of justice. The aftermath of the situation continues to unfold as Dolores Crabtree, once a staunch enforcer of HOA regulations, finds herself in an incredibly humiliating and legally precarious position. As Reggie Dubosi watches the police apprehend the actual criminals involved in the drug ring, he can't help but marvel at the absurdity of it all. Dolores, who had been so focused on his bright yellow Lamborghini and baseless accusations of criminal activity, had unwittingly disrupted a significant police operation. After Dolores is taken into custody, the officers ensure that everything is documented. Reggie, relieved that he's not involved in anything illegal and that his car remains untouched, is left to reflect on how quickly things escalated from a petty HOA dispute to a full-blown police intervention. He feels a mixture of frustration, disbelief, and amusement. All he had wanted was to live his life peacefully and enjoy his flashy car without the constant interference of Dolores and the HOA. As Dolores is questioned, Reggie takes a moment to collect his thoughts and sends a quick message to his lawyer, just in case. He never expected his morning to take such a turn, but the thought of Dolores's misguided attempt to accuse him of drug dealing is almost laughable. It's clear that her obsession with conformity, and her apparent racial prejudice, had clouded her judgment entirely. What's even more absurd is the fact that Dolores had actually broken into his garage with bolt cutters, which is a clear violation of his property rights. News of the incident spreads quickly throughout the neighborhood. By the time Reggie is able to head to the local police station to file his own report, the gossip mill in Willow Creek Estates is already in full swing. Mildred McMillan, one of Dolores's staunchest allies, nearly chokes on her cucumber sandwich when she hears about the situation. The HOA, once a source of frustration and constant interference for Reggie, is now on the defensive, scrambling to salvage its reputation. Meanwhile, Dolores's disgrace is becoming the talk of the town. Her attempt to enforce her own narrow-minded rules has backfired spectacularly. But the real twist comes when Reggie discovers that Dolores isn't just a bad HOA president, she's also been involved in some questionable financial dealings within the HOA. It turns out that Dolores had been using her position to line her pockets, inflating invoices, and mismanaging funds. News of this new scandal spreads just as quickly as the original story, and suddenly, Dolores's reputation is in tatters. To make matters worse for her, the HOA board, scrambling to distance itself from the scandal, decides to remove Dolores from her position as president. The same community that had once followed her every directive now sees her as nothing more than a figurehead for corruption and incompetence. Reggie, on the other hand, is now regarded as an unlikely hero. Not only did he stand up to Dolores's baseless attacks, but his situation led to the uncovering of her financial misdeeds. What's more, Reggie finds out that Jamal T. Henderson, the other Jamal Henderson in Pleasant Acres, the one with the neglected lawn, has now been elected as the new HOA president. The community, which had once rejected Reggie for his flashy car, is now embracing him as a savior of sorts. At this point, Reggie is enjoying his newfound status as the unlikely hero of Willow Creek Estates. However, the story doesn't end there. As the HOA cleans house, they offer Reggie a formal apology for their wrongful treatment, and to make matters even more amusing, the task force that investigated the drug ring takes a moment to pose for a photo with his Lamborghini, which is now considered a symbol of how an apparently offensive car saved the day. The aftermath of Dolores Crabtree's dramatic fall from grace spread quickly through the tight-knit neighborhood of Willow Creek Estates. News of her misguided, bolt-cutter-fueled investigation into Reggie Dubossy's garage turned from a local embarrassment into something much more damaging. Not only had she severely overstepped her bounds, breaking into Reggie's property, but her actions also inadvertently disrupted a police sting operation targeting a drug ring operating in the area. The irony of her behavior, combined with the public disgrace, made her the subject of gossip and ridicule. As the news of her fall from power traveled, Reggie found himself unexpectedly thrust into the role of a local hero. He had only wanted to enjoy his life and drive his Lamborghini, but now he was being praised for not only standing up to an HOA bully but for inadvertently helping to bring down a criminal network. Mildred McMillan, who had once stood by Dolores's side in her petty crusades against Reggie's flashy car, now found herself awkwardly avoiding eye contact with him every time they crossed paths. Reggie couldn't help but smile at the sudden shift in how people saw him. He was no longer just the guy with the too loud Lamborghini, he was the man who had helped take down a drug ring. It wasn't just Reggie's reputation that had improved. Dolores's downfall had sent shockwaves through the HOA. Members who had once been intimidated by her began questioning her leadership, with many residents openly criticizing her conduct. Within a few short days, Dolores was removed as president of the HOA, her position and influence shattered. The HOA board, eager to salvage whatever was left of its reputation, issued a formal apology to Reggie, acknowledging that the harassment he had endured was unwarranted. For Reggie, it felt like a personal victory, not just in terms of his own vindication, but also for the larger community. The small, tight-knit group of neighbors who had once dismissed him and his offensive car now found themselves turning to him for advice and support. It was as if Reggie had inadvertently become the leader of a new era for Willow Creek Estates, one that embraced individuality and diversity over conformity and petty rules. But even amidst this newfound respect, there was still the issue of Dolores and her actions. As part of the fallout from her attempts to frame Reggie, Dolores found herself embroiled in more than just HOA violations. As local gossip quickly revealed, Dolores had been involved in a series of shady financial dealings within the HOA. Reports surfaced of unexplained expenses, inflated invoices, and her penchant for ignoring the very rules she enforced with such vigor. This new revelation only deepened the scandal, and the HOA board found itself scrambling to deal with the fallout from both Dolores's personal and professional indiscretions. In the meantime, Reggie's life had shifted dramatically. His Lamborghini, once a symbol of neighborhood contempt, had now become something of a legend in Willow Creek Estates. It was a symbol of defiance, a reminder that sometimes, standing out and staying true to yourself could bring about positive change. As Reggie Dubossy settled back into his routine after the HOA drama, things in Willow Creek Estates had notably shifted. The once petty complaints and passive-aggressive emails from Dolores Crabtree and her allies had stopped, replaced with an odd sense of calm. Reggie could now take his Lamborghini, affectionately called Sunshine, for a spin without worrying about nosy neighbors or unjustified HOA fines. The community, once divided by petty rules and forced conformity, was now starting to embrace the uniqueness that Reggie had brought into their lives, albeit reluctantly at first. However, the peace was short-lived. Dolores Crabtree, humiliated and now facing charges for trespassing, property damage, and obstruction of justice, wasn't one to simply slink away quietly. Despite the mounting legal issues, Dolores was not about to let go of her desire to control the neighborhood. Reggie had been the one to expose her actions, and for that, she was seething with rage. As the days passed, Dolores began to rally her few remaining supporters from within the HOA. She wasn't the kind of person to accept defeat, especially when her authority was being questioned. Reggie had thought that Dolores's removal from the HOA board and her disgrace would be enough to shut her down for good. But he was wrong. Dolores had one final card to play. In the midst of all this, Reggie received a call from his lawyer, Dion, who had been keeping an eye on the developments surrounding the HOA. "Reggie," Dion began, her voice filled with both disbelief and concern, "it looks like Dolores is trying to sue you for slander and emotional distress." She's claiming you ruined her life and caused irreparable damage to her reputation. The lawsuit's already been filed. The irony was almost too much to handle. After Dolores had almost cost him his reputation, his property, and his peace of mind, she was now trying to take him to court for hurting her feelings. Reggie couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity. It seemed that Dolores hadn't learned her lesson at all. He immediately reached out to Dion, telling her not to worry. The case was ridiculous, and he was confident that it would be thrown out. He knew that the truth was on his side. He hadn't done anything to Dolores except expose her for what she truly was, an overzealous HOA president with a penchant for harassing her neighbors. But Dolores wasn't backing down. She still had a few tricks up her sleeve. Word on the street was that she was working behind the scenes, trying to leverage her connections to smear Reggie's name further. She wasn't just trying to regain her position in the HOA, she wanted revenge. As the legal battle started to unfold, Reggie found himself facing an unexpected wave of support from other residents of Willow Creek Estates. The ones who had once criticized him for his flashy car were now rallying behind him. Even Mildred McMillan, who had been a vocal critic of his car and his lifestyle, came forward to write a letter of support for him, stating that Reggie had been unfairly targeted and that Dolores's actions had been inexcusable. The HOA, now under new leadership, had become fractured. Reggie was no longer just the guy with the flashy Lamborghini, he was seen as a symbol of standing up for fairness and truth. His victory over Dolores had shown the residents that they didn't have to put up with the HOA's overreach. Reggie wasn't about to let Dolores regain control, not after everything she had done. And so, as the lawsuit continued to drag on, Reggie focused on what mattered most, his freedom, his car, and the sense of justice that had propelled him through this absurd saga. In the end, the residents of Willow Creek Estates learned a valuable lesson. Conformity and control could only go so far before they were exposed for what they were, petty, vindictive, and ultimately destructive. As the dust settled on the ridiculous saga of Dolores Crabtree and her failed attempts to bully Reggie Dubosi, life in Willow Creek Estates began to return to some semblance of normalcy. The community, which had once been tightly controlled by petty HOA regulations and enforced conformity, was starting to evolve. Reggie had inadvertently become a symbol of resistance, a man who had fought back against not only the HOA's overreach but also the racial prejudice embedded within the system. The legal battle with Dolores was still ongoing, but Reggie was confident that the truth would prevail. He had gathered enough evidence, and the support of the community was stronger than ever. The HOA, now under new leadership, was scrambling to recover from the scandal that had rocked its foundations. As Dolores continued to face the fallout from her actions, Reggie felt a sense of vindication. It was during one of the HOA's public meetings that the unthinkable happened. Reggie, who had once been a quiet observer of the neighborhood's proceedings, found himself at the center of attention. The new HOA board, recognizing the shift in public opinion, began to question the way things had been run under Dolores's leadership. The board members, many of whom had once sided with Dolores, now saw Reggie as the person who had exposed the flaws in their system and had stood up for the community's rights. The turning point came when Reggie was approached by several members of the HOA board after a particularly tense meeting. "Reggie," one of the board members began, "we've been discussing the future of the HOA, and it's clear that there's a need for change. We've all seen how your actions have inspired this community, and frankly, we could use someone with your vision." At first, Reggie was taken aback. The thought of taking on a leadership role in the HOA was both terrifying and tempting. He had spent years avoiding the HOA's interference and had grown accustomed to staying under the radar. But the idea of transforming Willow Creek Estates into a community that embraced individuality, creativity, and inclusivity had its appeal. "We want you to consider running for HOA president," another board member said, the words hanging in the air like a challenge. Reggie was stunned. How had this happened? Just a few months ago, he had been the subject of constant harassment by Dolores and her supporters. Now, he was being offered the keys to the kingdom. The power to reshape the neighborhood, to redefine what it meant to live in Willow Creek Estates, was within his grasp. He thought about it for a moment, weighing the possibilities. Could he really bring about the change the community needed? Could he truly reshape the HOA into something that didn't stifle creativity and individuality? The more he thought about it, the more appealing the idea became. After all, if he could survive Dolores's reign of terror, surely he could handle whatever came next. The following days were a whirlwind. Reggie found himself attending more HOA meetings, speaking with residents, and gathering support. Word of his potential candidacy spread quickly through the neighborhood. Many of the residents who had once silently agreed with Dolores's rule now saw Reggie as a symbol of hope, a chance to bring the community together and make Willow Creek Estates a place where everyone, regardless of their car's color or their lawn's length, could feel welcome. Then, on the night before the HOA election, Reggie made a final decision. He would run for president. It was a daunting challenge, but the more he thought about it, the more certain he became. He couldn't let the neighborhood fall back into the hands of those who sought to control every aspect of people's lives. It was time to make Willow Creek Estates a place that valued diversity, freedom, and the unique contributions of each individual. On the day of the election, Reggie stood at the front of the room, facing a crowd of eager, uncertain neighbors. He spoke from the heart, sharing his vision for a community where everyone could thrive, where the HOA would no longer be a tool for control but a resource for support. He promised to bring transparency, fairness, and inclusivity to the HOA, values that had been sorely lacking under Dolores. When the votes were counted, it wasn't even close. Reggie was elected as the new president of the HOA, much to the shock of those who had once dismissed him. The neighborhood had spoken, and they wanted change. They wanted a future where they could live without fear of being judged or fined for having a bright yellow car or a slightly overgrown lawn. Reggie had won. And with his victory, the future of Willow Creek Estates was brighter than ever. As the newly elected president of the Willow Creek Estates HOA, Reggie Dubosi walked into the first meeting with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. He had never anticipated finding himself in this position, especially after the long saga of battling Dolores Crabtree and her misguided attacks. But now, as he stood at the helm of the HOA, he knew that the real work was just beginning. His first order of business was to address the community. He knew the residents of Willow Creek Estates were divided, with some still loyal to Dolores and her authoritarian ways, while others had embraced his vision for change. As he entered the meeting room, Reggie was greeted with a mixture of applause, awkward silence, and skeptical glances. It was clear that some people were still unsure about what kind of president he would be. With a calm but determined voice, Reggie began his address. "Thank you all for your trust in me. I know that this community has been through a lot in the past few months. We've seen the impact of strict rules and judgmental attitudes. It's time for us to move forward. We will focus on inclusivity, transparency, and fairness. No more unnecessary fines or arbitrary regulations. Willow Creek Estates should be a place where everyone can feel welcome, no matter who they are or what their lawn looks like." The room was quiet as Reggie spoke, but he could sense that the tide was shifting. The residents who had once been afraid to speak up now seemed hopeful. They wanted change, and they wanted to feel heard. But Reggie knew that his leadership would be tested. He had promised to reform the HOA, but changing years of tradition wouldn't be easy. He had to contend with the lingering presence of Dolores's supporters and her network within the HOA. They weren't going to give up their power without a fight. After the meeting, Reggie sat down with the new HOA board members to discuss the upcoming tasks. It was time to overhaul the bylaws and create a new set of guidelines that reflected the community's evolving needs. He also began addressing concerns that had been raised during his campaign, from more lenient lawn care standards to ensuring that all homeowners were treated fairly, regardless of their background or property. The road ahead was not without its challenges. Reggie knew that there would be resistance from some corners of the neighborhood. There would be those who didn't want to see change and would fight to hold on to the old way of doing things. But he was determined to succeed, not just for himself, but for the entire neighborhood. As the weeks passed, Reggie found that being HOA president was a balancing act. He had to navigate the politics of the community while also staying true to his values. He worked closely with residents, holding open forums and encouraging dialogue. He wanted to be a leader who listened, not one who imposed rules from the top down. But the most surprising part of Reggie's new role was the unexpected support he received from his once criticized Lamborghini. The car, which had been the focal point of Dolores's wrath, had now become a symbol of Reggie's defiance against the rigid standards of Willow Creek Estates. Even Mildred McMillan, who had once disapproved of the car, now approached Reggie with a smile and a compliment about how it had brightened up the neighborhood. People began to see it for what it was, a car that represented individuality, not something to be ashamed of. In the end, Reggie realized that his victory wasn't just about winning the HOA presidency. It was about showing the community that it was okay to stand out, to be different, and to embrace what made each person unique. Willow Creek Estates was no longer just a place of conformity. It was becoming a place where people could express themselves without fear of judgment. But Reggie also knew that this was just the beginning. There would always be challenges ahead, and not everyone would agree with his approach. But one thing was certain, he was ready to take on whatever came his way, armed with his belief in fairness, justice, and the occasional ride in his bright yellow Lamborghini. As Reggie Dubosi continued his tenure as the president of the Willow Creek Estates HOA, the neighborhood underwent a transformation that even he had not fully anticipated. The change wasn't just in the bylaws or in the tone of the meetings, it was in the attitudes of the people who lived there. The once rigid, conformity-driven culture had started to loosen, replaced by an openness that reflected Reggie's leadership style, inclusive, thoughtful, and a little rebellious. The Lamborghini Urus, which had once been a symbol of division, was now an emblem of the new Willow Creek Estates. It wasn't just a car anymore, it was a conversation starter, a reminder that standing out wasn't something to be ashamed of. The very car that had once made Dolores Crabtree and others cringe was now seen as a positive symbol of individuality. Reggie couldn't help but smile every time someone complimented him on his car or mentioned how it had made them rethink the narrow views they'd once had about proper living in their neighborhood. Over the months, Reggie worked tirelessly to build bridges. He hosted community events, encouraged neighbors to interact outside of HOA meetings, and even started a neighborhood watch program to foster a greater sense of safety and unity. With each success, the community grew closer, and the toxic atmosphere that had once defined Willow Creek Estates slowly evaporated. Even Mildred McMillan, who had long been the queen of neighborhood gossip, had softened, offering Reggie a handshake at a recent barbecue and even admitting that his leadership had added something to the place. But not everything was without its challenges. A few of Dolores's most ardent supporters had not given up on their vision of what the neighborhood should be. They often voiced their dissatisfaction with Reggie's more relaxed approach to things, especially regarding lawn care standards and the occasional garage door color variants. Still, Reggie remained resolute. He knew that real change wasn't about pleasing everyone, it was about creating a space where diversity was respected and where rules weren't weaponized for personal gain. One day, a few months after Reggie had taken office, he found himself standing in front of a small group of neighbors. This time, however, it wasn't for a heated HOA meeting or a confrontation. This gathering was different. They were there to discuss a potential new initiative, a community garden. Reggie smiled as he listened to the excited chatter around him. The idea had been one of his many attempts to bring people together, and it was already becoming a reality. The garden would not only serve as a space for neighbors to grow fresh vegetables, but it would also be a testament to the new direction of the neighborhood. It was a shared project, something that reflected the cooperative, creative spirit that Reggie had worked so hard to cultivate. A few of the neighbors who had once been skeptical now volunteered to help build the garden, and for the first time, the community felt less like a collection of isolated homes and more like a real neighborhood. As the sun set over Willow Creek Estates, casting a warm glow over the homes, Reggie couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. He had faced countless challenges: racism, the hostility of the HOA, and even his own doubts. But through it all, he had persevered, and in doing so, he had changed the course of his community's history. There were still moments of conflict, of course. Not every neighbor agreed with every decision, and there would always be those who longed for the bold ways. But Reggie had learned that real change came not from appeasing everyone, but from staying true to his vision and his values. He had become a leader not because of his position, but because of the respect he earned by standing up for what was right. And as he looked at the neighborhood he had helped transform, Reggie realized that the true legacy of his presidency wasn't just the policies he'd put in place or the changes he'd made, it was the community he had built. Willow Creek Estates was no longer just a place of beige lawns and cookie-cutter homes. It was a place where people could truly live, express themselves, and embrace their differences. Maybe he would run again for president. Maybe he wouldn't. But whatever the future held, Reggie knew one thing for sure: Willow Creek Estates was now a place where every neighbor could feel proud of who they were and where they lived.